Hello and welcome to another one of our updates on the government's job retention scheme, or the furlough scheme as most people do refer to it. Now, one of the things that we're going to be talking about today, or the main thing we're going to be talking about today, is of course the change of nature of the scheme as of today, the 1st of July, because as of today the scheme becomes a flexible furlough scheme. So what that means in essence is that whereas before there was the requirement for employers and employees to ensure that the employee didn't undertake any work at all while they were on furlough, and they had to be on furlough for a block of at least 3 weeks. Now the scheme becomes completely flexible. So employees can work and be on furlough, and then work and be on furlough, and it can be interchanging quite regularly. So complete flexibility, which of course is going to be very important to employers as the relaxation of the rules of the lockdown begin to hit them, particularly in the retail and hospitality sectors. But before I get into the intricacies of the scheme and some of the frequently asked questions that I know you'll want me to address, let's just look at the basics of the scheme in the first instance. So what we have got is that employees can work part-time as well as be on furlough. So as I said, no requirement for that 3-week block. So what that could mean, for example, is that an employee could work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then be furloughed Thursday and Friday. Or alternatively could work 1 week and then be furloughed the following week. But there's no specific requirement for it to be in either blocks of weeks or blocks of days. There is nothing in the rules that prevents complete flexibility. So even if you wanted to have somebody working half days or a couple of hours a day, all of that is provided for in relation to the scheme, and means that employers can make a claim under the job retention scheme in relation to the furloughed hours, and then pay the employee as normal in relation to the hours that they have worked. There is no minimum notice period either, so it isn't that you have got to agree a week in advance or a couple of weeks in advance or anything like that. It is simply up to the employer to ensure that they keep accurate records of when the employee is furloughed and when the employee is working. So obviously the more complex that you make that arrangement, the greater record keeping that you will have, and of course it will probably make the actual claim to the job retention scheme that much more complicated as well. We're yet to see the actual way that the portal is going to be designed in order to accompany this flexibility, but it's bound to make it more complex. The other point to note in relation to submitting your claims through the job retention scheme is that you've now got to do them on a monthly basis. So you submit your claim for July, you submit your claim for August, and you submit your claim for September, and then also a further claim for October. So whereas before you could submit your claim and go back for the last couple of months or something like that, you're now not going to be able to. You've got to separate them out. There's also no specific requirement in relation to the type of work that the employees do when they are working part-time. So if you want them to do something different to their normal job, then that's perfectly okay. You can do that, obviously, as long as you agree that with the employee. And that's one of the real issues that, of course, you have got to address, because you need to agree this with the employee. So when we have a look at the actual agreement itself, so there is a requirement for you to have a new agreement for any employee that you are going to have on the flexible furlough scheme. And that doesn't mean that you've got to reissue these agreements right across the piece for any employee that is on furlough. That's not quite the case. If your employee or employees are continuing to remain on furlough full time, so just as they were in June, and that's going to continue into July and perhaps even August, September, October, then you can do so under the original agreement that you had in place with them. Now, if you are changing onto the flexible scheme, so you're going to want them to be working some part-time hours, that is then when you do need to have a new agreement in place with the employee. And as you can see, we've got a template agreement, so please do get in touch with us if you would like to have a copy of that, and contact details follow at the end of the video. But you need to have that agreement in place. And of course, one of the things that you must do within that agreement is actually set out the rules and the basis on which you require them to work part-time? How much notice are you going to give them? Are there going to be a number of guaranteed hours that you're going to provide, or a number of guaranteed days that you're going to provide? So that comes down to specific agreement with the individual or individuals. Okay, so now getting on to some frequently asked questions. So, is there an obligation on you to offer part-time working? Well, no, there's not. No obligation on you at all. So you can continue to furlough people as you have done previously, and you can call them back into work on a full-time, or should I say their previous contractual basis as before. You don't have to go into this flexible arrangement, even if it's asked for by the employee. So the only instance where you might need to find yourself going into this arrangement is, of course, if the original furlough arrangement that you had in place, the furlough agreement that you had in place, was, for whatever reason, was time limited. So if you put in a furlough agreement that expired at, say, for example, the 31st of July, then you are going to have to enter into a new agreement with that individual post 31st of July in order to continue to have the contractual right with that employee to furlough them. And also, of course, to provide evidence to the HMRC that you have a written agreement in place. So, as I said, written agreement, yes, we do need one. It's what you needed before, it's still what you need now in order to show to the HMRC that you have got that agreement in place, and so you can make valid claims, and of course you've got something in case you are challenged at some point in the future. Now, of course, in relation to the Flexible Furlough Scheme, if your agreement sets out the hours or the days that somebody is going to be working, then that's all well and good. And that, well, I say it's all well and good, it's perfect. But if you are entering into an arrangement which is going to be far more flexible, so within the agreement itself you just simply say that they will be working days and hours as agreed, in order to provide you with that flexibility under this flexible scheme, then of course you're going to need to keep a separate record of the hours and days that are worked in order to have that evidence to show to the HMRC. And you'll have to do that on an individual basis in relation to the agreements, and obviously in relation to the timekeeping. Now, going back to the agreements, you don't necessarily actually have to do that, or you wouldn't have to do that for every single individual if you have a collective agreement arrangement in place. So if you have collective bargaining in place, then you can sit down with the trade unions, agree what the Flexible Furlough Scheme agreement is going to be with them, and then that will simply then apply to everyone as per the collective agreement and the collective bargaining arrangements that you have in place. But obviously in the absence of that, then you do need to do it individually. Without agreement, you can't furlough your employee, even on a part-time basis, because if you were to do so, you're reducing their pay. And that, without agreement, is going to be clearly a fundamental breach of contract, which is then going to leave you exposed to, at the very least, a constructive unfair dismissal claim and deduction from wages claim. So it does come with a risk if you just simply force it on people without their agreement. And as I said, if you don't have their agreement, then it's likely that any claim to the CJRS scheme is going to fail in any event. Now, what's the relevance of the 10th of June? Well, we've referenced this in one of our earlier updates. The rules of the Flexible Furlough Scheme from the 1st of July is that only those people who have previously been furloughed can now access it. So there was a cut-off point. Now that cut-off point is based upon the fact that it's only people that have been validly furloughed up until the 30th of June that can then be continued to be furloughed beyond the 1st of July. Now, of course, because they have to be furloughed for a block of 3 weeks, that's then when we go back to the 10th of June being the cut-off date in relation to furlough. So then next frequently asked question, so what about family leave? Now, the one exception to this date of the 10th of June is that there has been an exception that's been provided by the government after some campaigning specifically by the Maternity Alliance in relation to those people who are returning from family leave. So for example, if a woman is returning from maternity leave and she returns from maternity leave, say on the 15th of July, then previously under the announcement made by the government that the cut-off date was the 10th of June, she couldn't be furloughed, and therefore making herself immediately potentially at risk of redundancy. Now, what the government have said is that anyone who hasn't previously been furloughed, but that the reason that they haven't been furloughed is because they were absent on a period of family leave, be that maternity leave, paternity leave, shared parental leave, adoption leave, so on and so forth. If that is the reason that they were absent and not able to be on the furlough scheme at an earlier date, then you will be able to furlough them. And they've also now extended that to also include military reservists as well. So is a 3-week rotation necessary? Well, as I mentioned really in the introduction, no, there isn't. There is no 3-week rotation necessary, or should I say, there is no 3-week minimum period, which then means that if you do want to rotate your employees around, then you can do so, and you can do so on as short a rotation period as you like. So you're not stuck with this 3-week rotation period as you had before. And training and national minimum wage, that's simply a reminder. Nothing's changed here, but remember that when somebody is furloughed, that they can undertake training activities. That is, of course, being in receipt of training, undertaking training, so not delivering training, just for the avoidance of any doubt on that point. If you have employees that as a result of them receiving only 80% of their pay whilst they're furloughed, if that drops them below the level of national minimum wage, then you do have to top that up to national minimum wage for the period of time that they are undertaking this training only. Okay, so otherwise, even if they fall below national minimum wage, that's perfectly okay under the furlough scheme. But if they're undertaking training, you've got to top it up. Now, other changes to the scheme. Now, again, we trailed this in our previous update, so there's nothing new here at all. So really just a reminder about the financial contributions that employers are going to have to make over the coming months. So as of the 1st of August, employers will have to be making a contribution in respect of the employer's pension contributions and also employers' national insurance contributions, which were previously covered by the government scheme, or should I say claimable back from the government scheme. From September, so from the 1st of September, employers will need to pay 10%. And when I say 10%, when we're having a look at the 80% that is being paid to the employee under the scheme, 70% is paid by the government, 10% is paid by the employer. And then come the 1st of October, there's then another step up again. So employers will contribute 20% and the government will contribute 60%. Now, so that's really a bit of a summary of the scheme. Now, there's been a bit of a change in relation to the Treasury Direction. So essentially what we've got is we've got a Treasury Direction and also guidance from the government in relation to the scheme. Now, on Friday of last week, the government published its, or should I say the HMRC published its 3rd version of the Treasury Direction, which sort of sits alongside the guidance. Now, this has introduced quite a worrying paragraph that we haven't seen before in any of the previous iterations of either the direction or of the guidance. So let me just show this to you. This is paragraph 2.2. Now, what paragraph 2.2 is saying here is that it's integral to the purpose of the scheme that the amounts paid to an employer are used by the employer to continue the employment of the employees. Now, what this point does is it does provide some doubt as to whether this actually specifically precludes the ability of employers to continue to make claims under the scheme when employees are in their notice periods for redundancy. Because this rule, this paragraph could be read one of two ways. Now, a number of employers and also a number of law firms have contacted the HMRC following the publication of this document on Friday evening to ask for urgent clarification on this point. Clearly it's going to have a significant impact on the finances of employers, and also, simply put, the way that they approach the making of redundancies and whether to give notice and have employees continue as employees during their notice period, enabling the employee to remain in employment, and also enabling the employer to continue to make a valid claim under the CJRS scheme. Or should employers in fact be cutting their losses be making employees redundant at the end of the consultation process, be making a payment, full payment in lieu of notice to them, in order to ensure that there is no holiday accrual and in order to ensure that they're not incurring any further costs during the notice period. Because of course, whilst employers are able to claim these payments from the CJR scheme during the notice period, employers are still accruing a holiday, and so there is still a cost that is being accrued by the employer, and employers don't want to be caught out in relation to this. There are a number of employers where, of course, they are in quite a very tight financial scenario and can't afford to be this. So there are two schools of thoughts here. So some commentators are very concerned about this new paragraph 2.2, and that fundamentally changes the rules of the scheme and provides that employers cannot claim any furlough payments whilst the employee is under notice of termination for redundancy. Or in fact, some think it might even go back before then, but I think that's personally, I think that's a bit of a pessimistic view to take. And in fact, when we look at the wording of this paragraph and have a close analysis of this wording, my view is that I don't think it's necessarily fatal. I mean, I appreciate I'm being quite careful with my wording there, and I'm saying that it's not necessarily fatal, because what the government is saying in this paragraph 2.2 is somewhat inconsistent with what they've said previously, both by the Chancellor of the Exchequer and also in previous government guidance. But what paragraph 2.2 is saying is that it's necessary that the payments paid to the employer are used by the employer to continue the employment of the employee. Now, my view of this is that if we are giving notice to an employee, and say, for example, if we give notice that their employment is going to end at the end of September, and we furlough them through to the end of September, they continue to accrue their holiday through to the end of September, then if we are, during that period of time, A, continuing the employment of the employee, B, also seeking alternatives to dismissal by reason of redundancy during that notice period. Now that could be, for example, it gives the opportunity for another employee to resign during that period of notice, for another vacancy to arise during that period of notice, for someone else to volunteer during that period of notice, or in fact there may be a change in the circumstances of the business. It might pick up a little bit more than the business was necessarily expecting, which means that they might be able to avoid the redundancy. Because of course the requirement to avoid the redundancy during that notice period is the same as it is before the decision was made. And so surely then, if at least you're setting the notice period up on that basis, then surely you're intending to try to ensure the continuity of employment for that individual. You might not be able to, and in fact it might be relatively unlikely that you would even be able to, but surely that is in accordance with the principles of the scheme and also in accordance with this new rule set out in paragraph 2.2. Now, in any event, we've been advising clients throughout to ensure that in circumstances where you are giving notice rather than simply paying in lieu, that you provide in the agreement that any money that you are unable to claim from the job retention scheme isn't payable to them. Now, of course, that comes with a number of issues attached to it in relation to the requirement to pay notice pay and also the ability to be able to reclaim, but it does give you a little extra tool in your toolkit, shall we say. Of course, now this has been particularly important also up until the period, or should I say up until the end of the period of the 31st of July, because up until the end of the 31st of July, that is in effect the period of time within which it is essentially or potentially free, for want of a better way of putting it, for the employer to keep the employee on furlough, because the employer isn't having to make any contributions to the scheme at that point. After the 31st of July, of course, the employer is having to make contributions to the scheme, and if in fact the employer simply can't afford to do that, or after all that's the reason they're in the redundancy situation in the first place, then that's unlikely to be reasonable. But until the 31st of July, there has always been this underlying or potential underlying argument that if you make somebody redundant before the 31st of July when they were willing to be furloughed, then isn't it the case that actually you're then turning down a reasonable alternative, albeit in the short term, to the dismissal? And then are you potentially rendering that dismissal unfair? So in a way, employers are damned if they do and damned if they don't in this particular circumstance. So anyway, don't quite panic yet. We'll of course keep you updated on the issue of this paragraph 2.2 and the issue of furlough pay and notice pay. Where we will hope to do so very shortly, but at the moment the HMRC are remaining silent to all of the tweeted questions that they are receiving. So watch this space, and in any event, watch this space in relation to our employment law update, because we may have more news for you by then. It's only a week away now, so please, if you want to book onto our employment law update, it's being held obviously by a webinar, 10 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday the 8th of July. So please check out our website and the links in relation to that in order to book on. But that concludes our update. So please do, if you want to get in touch, then do so. And obviously, as always, I'm afraid with all of these sorts of issues, please do seek some specialist legal advice. The intention of this video is just simply to try to bring you up to speed with all of the changes and to give you some knowledge in order to enable you to make some informed decisions. But please do seek some specialist advice on a number of the matters that have been raised here. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you on the 8th of July.